be coming up later on in a feature that we'll be working on, just looking back at the last 8 years that Dr. Patrick Njoroge was the governor of the central bank, looking at the highlights and how banks actually felt about his term. But now let's switch gears and have that conversation. My guest this afternoon, David Wanjohi, a senior manager from EY, a senior tax manager from EY. We just want to understand the impact of the new taxation measures. David, welcome to KTN.
Thank you.
All right, first things first, I want to get your initial reaction. Now, there's a lot of conversations that have happened in terms of when the finance bill was a bill, in terms of the recommendations. And I remember EY was one of those firms that actually took part in the public participation and also shared your views. Now that it has become law, what do you make of Kenya Kwanza's tax policy?
I think that's a very interesting question to ask. Based on some of the submissions that we saw before the parliament, there were over 1,000 people who submitted physically as well as on email. And I do commend the parliamentary committee in terms of trying to get as many comments as possible from the citizenry. And even if you look at the detailed report that they prepared and that they tabled before Parliament, you can clearly see that they tried their level best to incorporate a lot of these proposed amendments, but still the ones that were sticking out were those that relate to the take-home at the end of the day. So issues to do with the housing levy, issues to do with VAT, and the standard rating versus the exemption of certain VAT goods and services. So I think that's what largely also remained in the bill. And as you rightfully mentioned, those are the ones that were passed by the Kenya Kwanza government in a bid to fund their very ambitious budget. So I think we just need to brace for tough times ahead in terms of some of the disposable income that a lot of the citizens will take home.
All right, and of course, when you talk about disposable income, the first thing that Kenyans are going to feel the pinch is the 16% VAT on fuel. Correct. At the moment, we are paying, I think, the highest amount we have ever paid on petroleum products. Correct. Particularly when you see certain areas, in far-flung areas, paying almost 190 shillings per litre of fuel. What then should we expect going forward? An extra 8% has been added on to that cost. We're talking about 12 shillings extra per litre. Yeah. What is the ripple effect of that going forward? And also in comparison to our regional counterparts, our neighbors, in terms of when you look at their tax measures that they have, particularly on petroleum products, what can we learn, what can we borrow from there?
Yeah, so I think there are various things to consider in terms of VAT on fuel. Yes, there is the aspect of tax, but as we know, this is based on the fuel prices that are set by OPEC countries. So we do expect, because the price per barrel has been going down, we do expect that, yes, this will also go down in Kenya. And so based on the Kenya Kwanza's narrative, that this will then even out with time. But I think also by the time we get to that particular point in time, what we then find is that things will significantly go up. Yes, we will have the increment in terms of the fuel, but then this has a ripple effect in some of the daily goods. So you look at issues to do with transportation. So you look at things to do with production. We still have a lot of diesel-powered power in various homes, in various factories. So we do expect that there will be an increase in terms of cost. Something else that people have not also talked about a lot is the change in terms of this VAT status of certain things. So you see issues to do with VAT on transportation of sugarcane. There is certain VAT on certain inputs for agriculture, so pesticides and certain farm inputs. So we do expect all these measures from a VAT perspective, yes, from fuel, but other changes in the VAT status of various goods will have a ripple effect in terms of the cost of living.
And David, I know you have a lot of conversation and a lot of experts that you talk to and policymakers as far as taxation measures are concerned. Now, when you look at the amount of money that the government is looking to raise, do you think VAT and let's say 5% collection on betting, gaming and lottery, do you feel like the areas that are being taxed could potentially raise enough money to fund this budget?
Yeah, I think it's also something that's debatable. Yes, we have a very ambitious budget of about 4 trillion. If you look at that, maybe 800 plus goes towards 800 billion plus goes towards debt. As you rightfully mentioned, about 1.5 trillion is recurrent expenditure, vis-a-vis half of that being development expenditure. So we see it's a very ambitious budget that they do have. They want to actually fund this particular budget through various tax measures. A lot of them are particularly in the indirect tax space. So I'll give an example, as you said, of fuel. The thing that also needs to be considered, even with the experts in the Kenya Kwanza government, is that some of these goods and services don't have an inelastic demand. So people will inevitably look for alternatives. So whereas, yes, you think that there will be the same level of economic activity, for example, in terms of the transport sector, people will look for alternatives. Whereas people will take matatus, now they'll probably walk to work. If there were 2 vehicles in a household that would go, for example, to the offices, they would look for alternatives and probably use one. So we've seen this happening, especially with the slow economic downturn in the recent past. Even now as we speak, yes, we have a very ambitious budget, but KRA has not been able to finance the current target that it has. As of this month, there was a deficit of about 300 billion in terms of deficit. So if there is less disposable income, yes, they might be able to collect from the direct tax perspective, but from an indirect tax perspective, there'll be less money to spend. So whereas you go to the hotel, you go on holiday, you spend additional things maybe on your disposable income, now you'll not be spending that amount of money. So there'll be a dip in terms of the collections from an indirect tax perspective.
Yeah, and actually it is that deep that for me is a bit concerning, because at the same time when we're talking about making sure that we grow the economy, making sure that we help the economy bounce back, and yet here are all these taxation measures that are basically making sure that you do not get to spend as much as you would previously have spent. You do not have that disposable income to, let's say, go on holiday. What does that then mean for the tourism sector? What does it mean for the different stakeholders within that value chain? So do you feel, looking at these taxes, particularly the direct taxes, do you feel these are the right tax measures that are going to spur growth in the economy?
In my view, no. Even before this particular government, a lot of the deficit in tax was from direct taxes. This is because they were not performing well. Even if you look at statistics, out of about 50 million Kenyans, working population is about maybe 28 million, but the people who file taxes are about 6 million. The people in formal employment are about 3 million. So yes, you'll be able to capture the direct taxes from some of this population, but whereas the majority of the people, maybe 75%, who are not captured within the indirect tax space, the government was benefiting through indirect taxes. So they'll then be able to meet a lot of their revenue targets from an indirect tax perspective, but not a direct tax perspective. So the more you keep on trying to reduce the amount of disposable income that people have, they won't be able to spend. So the people who are even in informal sectors, who are not paying some of these direct taxes, will still have less at the end of the day to be able to spend. So therefore, you will still not collect from both an indirect and a direct tax perspective.
Let's talk about capital gains tax now. The conversation globally has been the issue of making sure that also the wealthy pay their fair share of taxation. Do you feel that imposing capital gain tax that is on share transfer and partnership interest is going to raise enough money and also make sure that the wealthy, so to speak, are paying their fair share? Or are we looking at a scenario where, yes, we have the capital gains tax at 20%, but then people will find loopholes around it?
Yeah, so maybe I can give 2 scenarios. One, and I think you've seen this in the media of late, yes, there was an increment from 1st of January in terms of capital gains tax. The increment from 5% to 15%. Yet when you look at the data, it then resulted in less economic activity in that space. Therefore, even the collection that they would have from a capital gains tax perspective has actually dipped. I think that's what people talk about, deadweight loss or the Laffer curve. So then it reduces the economic activity that would result in increase in taxes. Even if you look at other places like the US, I think in the 70s, there was a proposal to then tax yachts which are considered to be for some of the luxurious and more prominent people. The alternative, therefore, was, whereas people were not then buying yachts, they were then, because this is something you can be able to sail anywhere in the world, people then opted to buy some of these expensive boats in other countries. So the government's intention to collect more taxes from the rich wasn't necessarily met. So this might be the case in this particular instance where we are talking about capital gains, but I think we only have to wait and see.
Let's talk about zero rating LPG. Is this a good move? What is the impact of that?
Personally, I think it's a good move. If you look at a lot of the conversation around the carbon emissions, so the movement from using some of the traditional fossil fuels to LPG, we think, I think it's a good move to be able to encourage a lot of the citizenry to then move from some of those fossil fuels now to LPG. So we probably need to see what other incentives are provided in terms of the paraphernalia and infrastructure that will be able to assist the uptake of this LPG by a lot of the low-income households.
All right, let's talk about pay. Now, this hasn't happened for quite some time, and currently we're having a situation where there's a 2.5% increase in terms of those earning between 500,000 to 800,000. They're going now to pay an extra 2.5%. Let's talk about that. In terms of, when you look at our economy, first of all, what is the size or the number of Kenyans that make above 500,000?
Yeah. Okay, I'm not a statistician or a mathematician, but I know based on some of the data that we have available in the public record from, like, for example, the KRA, we have about 3 million people in formal employment. Out of that, a majority, I would even say more than 70%, earn less than 100,000. So if you talk about 500,000, I mean, it's point-something% of the population. So whereas the government might potentially think that they would collect a lot of money from this population, that might not be the case. And as you rightfully said, yes, they might be able to collect, because it's an easier way to collect some of these taxes by burdening, for example, the employers to deduct some of these taxes, but then the resultant effect will be felt by the low-income households. So whereas you were earning 800,000, you're able to fund a lot of people. For example, in your rural home, you have 2 nannies, you'll be able to spend a lot more, as you're saying, on holiday, on other expenses that you have on a monthly basis. Now when you're forced to reduce your disposable income, therefore there might be a dip in some of the other collections. So as you're saying, catering levy, airlines, the tourism sector might be affected, as well as the other people who work for some of these people who earn this money.
All right, now an extra 5% for those earning above 800,000 shillings per month. And of course, that is quite a small bracket compared to the majority who earn between, and I remember there's a statistics that was done by KNBS showing that upwards of 70% of salaried Kenyans make less than 50,000. So here we are saying we're increasing the tax bracket. Now, I just want to know, from where you sit, looking at this this inaugural policy and this finance bill and the inaugural budget, do you feel that the tax policies that Kenya Kwanza have is the right way to go, or what would you consider the missteps that they have made in this finance bill?
For me, I would say listening to the citizenry and reading the room. As you rightfully said, a lot of the submissions were submitted to the parliamentary committee, but even a study says that 90% of the population were rejecting the proposals in the finance bill, whereas, yes, 90% of the proposals found their way into the act. Maybe I take you back to some of the history around tax, way back when there was the need to fund war and conquering. So therein, a lot of the governments then would then request the citizenry to pay taxes in exchange for representation and public services and goods. So the reason why the democracy sort of system came into being is because people are paying taxes. So you and I are paying taxes so that we can then be able to be represented by Parliament in terms of our interests. So if we provide our proposals to Parliament and they do not then consider these, then there is some sort of mismatch in terms of the social contract we have with the government. So I think it's a bit unfortunate from that. We hope they will be able to collect the right amount of taxes to then be able to give us some of the public goods and services.
And of course, this tax conversation is one that we can never have enough, considering the fact that we're always talking about widening the tax bracket. But on that note, we want to take a quick break here on Business Today. When we come back, we'll either continue with the conversation and also just trying to follow what is happening within the Senate. Stay with us.